We are all watching the same shoreline on drought, water bankruptcy, and the pond at our farm. Days before the rain was scheduled to start, clients began messaging me to ask what would happen if it rained during their weekend sessions. We will sing and we will stand in the rain and we will rejoice, I said. In the upstate of South Carolina and beyond, we are living in a historic drought. Most people have no idea what's happening. And these people are smart, savvy, compassionate, and aware, but they live indoors and buy their food from a store. Their water comes from a tap, and while they notice their lawn is browning, they assume it's just the South working its weird, warm weather dance. I'm no better than them, but I work outside every day. Green and growing grass is money credited back into our hay budget. Lawn seed equals food. I'll save my whining about golf courses for another day, but I'm here this week to talk to you about what the land is saying, because the way our lives are designed makes it easy to miss. We have a magical pond at Lavender Hill. It's 2 acres of underground spring water, stocked and tended by a previous owner about 30 years ago. So it's a relatively recent addition to this land's 2 centuries of farming. I've studied the USDA surveys from the pond's construction, and even though my world revolves around checking water troughs, it took the maps to drive home to me that all these picturesque bodies of water you see dotted around fields are backup water to supply livestock in years of drought. I found this handwritten note on the original planning draft for the pond. It says, "This pond will supply livestock needs in years that do not reflect the severity of a 50-year drought, but it will theoretically go dry during a 50-year drought." Across the street, our neighbors have a large pond that I've stared at all winter as I sit at the table and write. The spring foliage is beginning to block the view, but throughout the cold months, my mother and I worried over the dropping shoreline. "Does it seem down today?" she would ask as we judged the visibility of a downed tree at the edge. The tree became our water gauge. We came up with wild stories, fearing that they were draining the pond on purpose, as if they planned to sell the land and the water was a liability for developers. Finally, we just asked them. The water line was steadily shrinking because of the drought. I'm assuming their pond is fed by a creek or another surface waterway. The only thing keeping our pond filled is the underground spring that feeds it, but recently I've seen the shoreline dropping. The neighbors were deeply worried about how low their pond had shrunk over the winter. A 50-year drought is one thing, but what we're experiencing in the upstate of South Carolina is something else entirely. This region is a temperate rainforest, and spring is historically our wet season, drenching our mountain water reservoirs and soaking the ground so spring planting will take root. In my not too distant memory, the area where I live and work was rural. Old farmers lived and worked by the seasons, the rainfall, and variations in the elements from year to year. Now we plant subdivisions in every old field, and for most people, drought only affects how green and lush their yards are. Few understand the severity of the drought we're in. The scale, a record-breaking drought. The United States Drought Monitor was unveiled at a White House press conference in 1999. A joint effort between the National Drought Mitigation Center at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, NOAA, and the USDA. This type of venture had never been accomplished before, taking the scattered, varied science of dryness and rendering it into a single, unified weekly map that could move policy, trigger federal response, and create a visual aid to simplify the numbers showing what the land was or wasn't receiving from the sky. Before 1999, localized monitoring existed in a piecemeal form, but this effort was a standardized national collection that blended hard data with boots on the ground observation. It was designed to bridge the gap between what instruments measured and what farmers already knew in their bones. It's a standard tool now, and it's used to trigger a response in crises, a database that pushes the government to acknowledge when there's not enough water. Most people have never heard of this initiative. Most people don't need to know what these groups do until they do. I didn't know the map existed until I sat down to write this piece. I digested these dates and numbers and I thought, how curious that our pond at Lavender Hill was born the year the United States Drought Monitor was developed. The turn of the millennium was when I bought Max, my little red-headed quarter horse, and launched myself from a desk and into the world of building a horse farm. There was a drought the summer I quit my real jobs to clean stalls. I remember thinking my body couldn't take the heat, and later being amazed that I had adapted. Currently, the US Drought Monitor shows the worst ever recorded drought for the southeastern states. It is the largest area of severe drought since the map began. It's the only comparison available because in 25 years of weekly measurement, the map has never looked like this. Back even further past the maps and into the raw historical record, it gets even worse. Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina have just lived through the driest September through March since 1895. Like its recent antithesis, the floodwaters of Hurricane Helene, this drought goes way past recent memory. This is not just the driest season on record in a generation, but the driest in 130 years of keeping local records. My hometown and state have not seen a period this dry since the time the land was worked by mule, and the people who farmed it watched the sky because from the clouds came their downfall or their salvation. In my daily life and the paragraphs I text to my clients who are hoping for fair weather in the hour they're visiting me to hang out with the horses, the drought lives in the crispy green grass that isn't growing and holds no nutrients for forage. The drought descended last year when hay farmers should have been baling a last cutting to get livestock through the winter. That didn't happen. We crossed our fingers, knocked wood, and spat on the ground, hoping that our new hay guy would have enough round bales of rye to see our herd through the winter. We rolled the last round bale out to the horses in the pasture beside the arena last week. Drought-hardy weeds are flourishing. The grass is sparse. Clover is having a literal field day. I like clover. I might plant more as we get to know these fields. Through the icy winter, I longed for spring, when the pastures would burst with grasses and we could walk the fields with an agent from the Agricultural Extension Service and make a plan to seed new grass and rotate fields. Now I'm just longing for a good, soaking, drenching rain that will bathe the ground surface. We're past the point of worrying about the underground water tables. We need a Band-Aid before we can hope for a long-term solution. Hay production is at a halt for the first cutting. We're not a drought-savvy region. Farmers don't irrigate their fields in upstate South Carolina. The ground across most of the region has been running 8 to 16 inches below where it should be over the 9 months since last July. Since the beginning of 2026, we have been 4 to 8 inches short. That is not a problem that the next good rain fixes. That is not something a wet week erases. The land is behind in a way that accumulates. Every dry day, borrowing against a debt the forecast doesn't have the means to repay. Too much or not enough. What would it take to correct the water deficit in my little corner of the world? In short, the slim chance of a correction is sobering. A full drought recovery typically requires 6 to 12 inches of above normal rainfall delivered over several weeks. And those numbers reflect extra precipitation on top of whatever normal rainfall the region should be receiving. As we move into summer, a time when the South is accustomed to seasonal drought, any rain that falls right now is subject to high evaporative demand, which limits its actual benefit. And evaporative demand is currently drawing down reservoirs already dealing with low inflows. Spring and summer heat means a meaningful portion of whatever rain falls will evaporate before it can soak in and do any restorative work underground. December through March is historically when the Southeast recharges its water resources in soils, stream flows, and groundwater. A recharge didn't happen this year, meaning the region is entering its warm season with less stored water than normal. Even if rainfall were to return to near normal values, the drought may linger given the accumulated deficits of the past 9 months. And given the severity of this deficit, the driest on record, many South Carolina regions will likely remain in drought status throughout the duration of summer this year, regardless of any late coming spring rainfall. A single good rain or even a good week of rain doesn't fix the drought we're experiencing. What's needed is a prolonged, consistent return to above normal precipitation over months, or, as older farmers in this region have long understood, a tropical system. A hurricane or a tropical storm delivering slow, soaking rain over several days has historically been the only thing capable of breaking a drought of this depth in the Southeast. But like the current drought's historical rarity, these mountains and foothills are still bracing from the recent memory of Hurricane Helene. We either have too much rain, which is deeply destructive, or not enough. Red and the ledger. While I have watched the shorelines of my neighbor's pond creep inward this winter, the United Nations met in January and declared that the world had entered an era of global water bankruptcy. A crisis implies a temporary shock that we'll bounce back from. Water stress describes high pressure that is still reversible. But the scientists at the United Nations University Institute for Water, Environment, and Health chose a word that we can all understand: bankruptcy. We're in a global, post-crisis condition. The damage has accumulated past the point where natural systems that hold and replenish water cannot bounce back to what they were. Kava Madani, the director of that institute and the lead author of the report, described the current state of water stores like an accountant. Nature provides every region with water income from rain and snow that accumulate from the sky, and for most of human history, we spent within our means. Then we began drawing from savings. Then we drew from aquifers that had taken centuries to fill. Then we drained the wetlands. Then we redirected the rivers. Then we built cities in deserts and watered imported crops grown in land not meant for farming. We've cashed in our savings. In finance, Madani said, when you spend more than you earn for too long, you go bankrupt. We have done exactly that with our water checking and savings accounts. More than half of the planet's large lakes have lost water since 1990. 70% of major aquifers are in long-term decline. An area of wetlands nearly the size of the European Union has been erased from the earth in 50 years. Global glaciers have lost 30% of their mass since 1970. 4 billion people, roughly half the population of this planet, experience severe water scarcity for at least 1 month every year. Between 2022 and 2023, 1.8 billion people were living under active drought conditions. The cost of drought impacts globally runs to $307 billion annually. 3 billion people and more than half of all global food production are concentrated in areas where water storage is already declining or unstable. These are not projections. They are not worst case scenarios from a distant future. They are current conditions. We've heard the names of the places that are being impacted first. Kabul is on its way to becoming the first modern city to fully run out of water. Mexico City is sinking into the ground at a rate of around 20 inches a year because the vast aquifer beneath its streets is being pumped out faster than it can recover. The cities of Jakarta, Bangkok, and Ho Chi Minh City are doing the same. In the American Southwest, the states that depend on the Colorado River are in continuous legal and political conflict over how to divide water that no longer exists in the quantities the original agreements assumed. The rivers sharing contracts were written for a river that no longer exists. They're working from agreements built on a world that no longer exists, governing a resource that has permanently diminished. The UN report is direct. Many of these systems cannot return to their historical baselines. We're not experiencing a gap that a wet year will fix. For many of the world's water systems, what existed before is simply over, and what exists now is the new permanent condition. Drought impacts cost the world $307 billion every year. But the UN report notes that even financial markets are not pricing in water risk at the scale the data demands. The world powers are handling the water deficit as a pool of temporary crises, each threat handled in isolation without considering the whole. As I sit here typing and watching the neighbor's pond through the trees, I think about the USDA survey stating that our spring fed 2 acres will theoretically go dry during a 50-year drought. Before moving here, I never knew that ponds were managed by the USDA and the Army Corps of Engineers. I never knew what it took to make a water reservoir. The neighbor's pond is shrinking because the surface water that feeds it is not being replenished. Our pond is deep because of what is stored below the ground rather than what falls from above. But eventually, the invisible will be made visible. I'm watching the shoreline move. I'm seeing the margin narrow. The United Nations did not issue its report about the pond at Lavender Hill. It details Kabul and Mexico City, the Colorado River, and the aquifers beneath cities where 2 billion people live on ground that is slowly collapsing beneath them. But the mechanism is the same. The language of bankruptcy, spending what cannot be replaced, drawing down savings that took centuries to accumulate, describes what I can see from the edge of my own property. We are all, at every scale, watching the same shoreline. The land remembers us back. It rained on Saturday. We hadn't received the ground-drenching, debt-erasing rain we needed, but it rained during lessons, and nobody melted. The horses were just fine. Well, the boys crowded into their shelter in the cemetery field, angling for the best cover like little slinking sharks. We were glad for every drop that fell. When the rain finally comes after a dry spell, you don't run for cover, well, unless you're in the boys' field. You stand in it. I did my twilight fence check as a slow mist continued to fall. The light was soft and hazy around the edges, mist weaving through the drought-tolerant weeds. The grass smelled alive, and as I walked, I watched the blades visibly start greening. Along the way, I passed through an oak grove. Each tree carried a distinct scent, like an olfactory record of its history. I stopped and buried my nose in wet bark. Though the trees are old and reaching, their scent caught in my body like recalling a memory. I was flooded with the full sensory pull of déjà vu. All those scents contain chemistry. Rainfall carries nitrogen from the atmosphere directly to the ground. It's free fertilizer delivered from the sky, a supply chain that can't be damaged by shipping lane closures. I say this because the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow passage through which a significant portion of the world's fertilizer supply moves, has been disrupted, and the cost and availability of synthetic nitrogen is astronomically increasing the cost of fertilizer that domestic farmers rely on. Rainfall is not just water, it is nutrition, the most ancient and elegant delivery system on Earth. And humans have tried forever to replicate it and engineer around it. We always come up short. The oak grove in the cemetery pasture has been receiving rain for longer than this country has been keeping records. It was there before the pond was dug. It was there before the subdivisions began to grow within the fields. It was there when the people buried in that pasture was still alive and working this land by hand and watching the same sky I watch now, hoping for rain. Gen X flashback. 1999 was the year the pond at Lavender Hill was excavated and the US Drought Monitor was established. It was also the year my grandfather, a man who had lived through enough history to know that the future was not guaranteed, cashed out his investments, bought a farm, and started stacking supplies. Y2K was coming, and he was not going to be caught unprepared. He had a different last name than I did, so I used him as a case study. He was a character in a feature story about the upcoming turn of the millennium. For the fortunes my grandfather made in the radio industry, he trusted the land more than the inventions built on it. He was preparing for the collapse of the digital infrastructure on which the modern world had come to depend, and he wasn't wrong to take it seriously. He was also, as it turned out, preparing for something that didn't arrive in the form he expected. The computers didn't fail at midnight on New Year's Eve, 1999. They kept going. They multiplied. People laughed at their folly and went back to their lives, their lawns, and their water taps, all of which were soon to be controlled by even more computers. And the running of these machines has become one of the quietest claims on water that no one anticipated or prepared for. In 1999, data center water consumption was so negligible that nobody was tracking it. That is not the case now. American data centers consume an estimated 449 million gallons of water every day. The Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory projects that figure could double or quadruple by 2028. Data centers in Texas alone are expected to use as much as 399 billion gallons of water by 2030, enough to lower Lake Mead by more than 16 feet in a single year. Two-thirds of all American data centers built since 2022 have been sited in areas already classified as high water stress regions. Scientists at the University of California, Riverside estimate that every 100-word AI prompt consumes roughly one bottle of water. Every search, every query, every generated paragraph. My grandfather was afraid the machines would stop. He couldn't have known that what we'd need to worry about was the cost of keeping them running. 26 years later, as I watched my neighbor's pond shrink and I rolled the last big rye bale out to our fields, I realized that my grandfather was not wrong about society being vulnerable. He just had the timeline wrong. The moment when the systems we depend on reveal themselves as more fragile than we thought isn't coming as a digital glitch at the stroke of midnight. It's slinking here slowly in the drop of shorelines, aquifers, and rain gauges. The difference between 1999 and now is that in 1999, we were afraid of a specific date. We could see it coming on the calendar, prepare for it, and exhale when it passed. What we are living inside now has no date on the calendar. It's been arriving for decades in increments too small to feel on a normal day, which is exactly why so many smart, caring, aware people have no idea until perhaps right now that we are in the driest stretch this region has seen since Grover Cleveland was president. Field notes. I'm not here to fill you with doom. We just need to be more aware and start seeing where we can take action. The more I answered clients' weather questions this week, the more I realized that I have the luxury of perspective. I live and work outside every single day, and I have no other choice but to pay attention to what's happening on the land. Deeper than that, the move from the old farm to the new has driven home the difference between healthy soil and thirsty ground. As I wear a path on the walk to the boys' field, I know in my bones that the land is not done. It just needs us to listen. The oak grove is not done. The underground spring that keeps our pond full when the surface water is gone is still moving, still cold, still finding its way through rock. The clover that took over the pasture while the grass went sparse is fixing nitrogen into the soil on its own, without any help from humans, the way it's done since before there were farms here or fences or anyone keeping records of the rainfall. The nitrogen the rain delivered on Saturday is already in the ground. It's raining more this morning. The natural world is not waiting for us to solve the water problem. The earth craves balance, even when we're standing in its way. The seasons work through the constraints that they've been given, finding a path through and converting what's available into what's needed. It's been doing this through every drought in the 130 years of records and in the thousands of years before anyone was keeping them. The question is not whether the land can adapt. The land will outlast all of us. The question is whether we are paying attention enough to adapt alongside it. My grandfather's instincts were not wrong. The right response to a fragile system is to pay attention and to get to know your land and water. It's up to us to figure out where the spring is and how deep the aquifer runs beneath our feet. The right response is to understand the grasses and save your hay and ask your neighbors what's happening with their shoreline instead of making up stories about why it's dropping. And when the rain finally comes, even if it's not enough, we can stand in it for a minute instead of rushing beneath the roof and viewing it as an inconvenience. You can bury your nose in the wet bark of an oak tree that has survived everything that humans and weather have done to it for longer than any record shows. You breathe in, you smell the nitrogen, you feel the ground receive what the sky is offering. And then you go back inside and tell people what you saw, because we're all living on the same shoreline. But some of us just happen to be standing close enough to the water to hear the waves. Love, Kim.